everyone. My name is Olivia Proulx, and welcome to An Unreasonable Degree of Scientific Certainty, a podcast where we dissect miscarriages of justice from the lens of a forensic scientist. A phrase that used to be used often in court by forensic scientists was that they could match evidence to someone involved in the case with a reasonable degree of scientific certainty. This term has since been taken out of use due to how vague and misleading it can be for triers of fact in the courtroom, hence it being used as the name for this podcast, which attempts to illuminate how forensic science, when practiced improperly, can result in innocent people being put in jail, guilty people getting away, and victims or their families being left without proper justice or closure. Today, I will be discussing the case of a man named David Camm, but before I cover the miscarriages of justice involved in his case, I must tell the story of the crime that started it. On the evening of September 28, 2000, in the city of Georgetown, Indiana, David Camm's wife, Kim, who was 35 at the time, was driving home with their two children, 7-year-old Bradley and 5-year-old Jill, from their swim practice around 7 p.m. This was the last time the three were seen alive. They pulled into the garage of their family home around 7:30 p.m., and as soon as Kim stepped out of the car, she was shot. The children bore witness to their mother's death before the killer aimed the gun at them. Bradley was shot as he tried to crawl over the back seat to hide in the trunk of the SUV before the killer shot Jill as she was still strapped into her car seat. The killer then removed Kim's shoes and socks and placed them on the hood of their car before leaving the scene. David arrived home from playing basketball with his friends at the Georgetown Community Church at approximately 9:26 p.m., finding his family dead. Instead of calling 911, David called his former police unit from when he served as an Indiana State Trooper. When later asked why he did not call 911 first, he said, "My thought process first was, these are my people. I needed help." When police arrived on the scene, they found David frantic in the driveway of the home. David claimed he had pulled his son Bradley from the vehicle, thinking he may still be alive, and attempted to revive him to no avail, but police were skeptical of his claim. Detective Sam Sarkisson stated, quote, "Usually, if you have someone come upon a crime scene, and they talk about rendering aid or being involved in the crime scene, then there's footprints. I didn't see any footprints," end quote. Just 4 days later, on October 1st, David was arrested by police and charged with all 3 murders, shortly after making a public plea for the killer to come forward. Before we continue to the investigation in the court case against David Camm, it is important to explain some of his and his family's background, since past events in their lives heavily influenced the police when carrying out the investigation. When David Camm and Kimberly Starr Wren first met, they seemed as though they were perfect for each other and decided to get married in May of 1989. David soon became an Indiana State Trooper, and Kim became pregnant with their first child, Bradley, in 1992. During that same year, David met a woman who worked at the gym he was a member of, named Stephanie McCarty, and the two became friends. 2 years later, in 1994, Stephanie had broken up with her boyfriend, and the two decided to pursue a relationship while David was still married to Kim. The two lovers did not seem to try keeping their relationship a secret, as they often went to clubs, bars, and sporting events together while Kim stayed home taking care of the baby, thinking David was at work. Stephanie briefly ended her relationship with David upon learning that Kim had become pregnant with their second child, but they ended up back together. Kim had been suspecting David of having an affair, and when confronted, he asked for a divorce. He destroyed the family kitchen after learning his mother would not let him move in with her, and other state troopers were called to the violent scene. After this, Stephanie allowed David to move in with her, and he was notably absent from the birth of his second child, Jill, in February of 1995. About a month afterwards, David started threatening to shoot himself over his jealousy and suspicions that Stephanie still had feelings for her ex-boyfriend and acting extremely possessive in their relationship. Stephanie decided to move out, and David reconciled with Kim shortly after. Things seemed to go well for the family for 2 years, but in 1997, David began hooking up with another woman, an old friend named Michelle Voiles. He also pursued a family friend, Lisa Corfage, and then continued to have multiple relationships over the next several years with other women outside of his marriage. David then ran into trouble at his job when he and several other officers were accused of assault by a 19-year-old. Despite being cleared of any wrongdoing, David was moved to patrolling a casino, which he considered a demotion. This led to him leaving his job and starting in a sales position at a company called United Dynamics Incorporated. David seemed to stop pursuing other women after leaving the state troopers, and the family seemed to be in a good place. But according to one of Kim's friends, she allegedly stated that, quote, "history is repeating itself," end quote. We'll now fast forward to about a year after the murders were committed to 2002, when David's trial began on January 14th. There were two main points that the prosecution used in their case against Camm: his history with his family and blood spatter evidence. Both his long history of infidelity to his wife and the times he treated his family coldly were heavily discussed, with almost a dozen women testifying that Camm had either propositioned or had affairs with them during his marriage. The prosecution also brought forth blood spatter evidence, analyzed by a bloodstain and crime scene expert named Rodney Englert. He identified 8 small stains of blood on David Camm's shirt as high-velocity impact spatter that would have resulted from him being a few feet away from the victims when they were shot, although David claimed the blood got on his shirt when he pulled his son Bradley from the car. Despite David's claims, the testimony provided by Englert proved to be damning. The prosecution also stated that David had allegedly molested his daughter Jill, despite there not being much evidence to support the claim. This claim arose from evidence found during the autopsies of the victims, since Jill had evidence consistent with sexual abuse occurring within 12 to 24 hours of her murder, but there was no proof that it was caused by her father. The defense was able to present an alibi for David, since he had arrived at the Georgetown Community Church to play basketball around 7 p.m., the same time his wife and children were heading home, and was there until he left closer to 9:30. The prosecution posited that he had snuck out during one of the games, committed the murders, and returned without anyone noticing, but 11 men who were playing basketball with David that night corroborated his alibi and stated that he did not leave, and none of them noticed any blood on his shirt. After the evidence was presented by both sides, the jury deliberated for 2 days and found David Camm guilty of 3 counts of murder on March 17, 2002. On April 11th the same year, he was sentenced to 195 years behind bars and was sent to the Indiana State Prison. There were multiple problems with David Camm's first trial, the first of which was the bloodstain expert Rodney Englert. Englert actually did not attend the crime scene himself during the investigation, but sent a crime scene photographer with no formal training or experience in bloodstain pattern analysis instead, a man named Robert Stites. Although Englert identified the stains found on David Camm's shirt as high-velocity impact spatter, other experts in bloodstain pattern analysis later analyzed the bloodstains and disagreed. They stated that the bloodstains were more consistent with transfer patterns, which would have occurred as David's shirt brushed against his daughter's hair as he removed his son from the vehicle. Englert had also previously contributed to the wrongful conviction of a woman named Julie Ray, who was falsely accused of murder and was acquitted after new evidence arose implicating someone else as the killer. Englert's testimony that there were blood cast-off patterns on her nightgown helped lead to her conviction in the first place. On June 2nd of 2003, Englert had an ethics complaint filed against him with the American Academy of Forensic Science by a number of other bloodstain experts, including Herb McDonnell, who established the professions of bloodstain pattern experts in 1971. They alleged that Englert had misrepresented his education, training, and experience, and this led to Englert suing them for slander. It is interesting to note that there is a further example of unprofessionalism among forensic scientists related to Englert and McDonnell, since the latter called Englert many names that contributed to Englert suing him, such as a liar for hire, a very smooth charlatan, and the Bin Laden of bloodstains. Despite this instance of unprofessionalism on McDonnell's part, all of the experts that filed the complaint against Rodney Englert expressed opinions in support of David Camm being innocent. If the blood spatter had been identified properly by an expert during the first trial, it is possible David Camm would not have been convicted. The second problem with the initial investigation leading to the first trial was that police neglected to test key evidence found at the crime scene, since they believed so strongly that Camm had committed the crimes. A gray sweatshirt that had been purchased from the Indiana Department of Corrections that had the word backbone written in black ink inside the collar was found at the crime scene, tucked near 7-year-old Bradley's body, which the police and prosecution neglected to test for DNA. There were also fingerprints found in the car that did not belong to any member of the Camm family, but they were not processed before the first trial. Investigators claim they did not process them because Kim parked in a public space every day while at work, so it would be a waste of time. This shows an extreme case of tunnel vision, where police were so sure it was David Camm that killed his family that they neglected to follow up on any other evidence that might suggest otherwise, biasing their investigation and causing them to not properly test evidence to rule out or explore other possibilities in the case. After being put in prison, David Camm and his defense team continued working to try and prove his innocence. They were able to have his case heard by the Indiana Court of Appeals, and on August 10, 2004, the court overturned the jury's verdict, granting him a retrial and allowing him to post a $20,000 bond and be placed on home incarceration. They did so on the basis that David's history of cheating on his wife should not have been used as evidence for the motive of the murders during trial, saying that they were not enough to prove motive, thus scrapping most of the prosecution's original argument. The next development in the case came in March of 2005 when the gray sweatshirt and fingerprints found at the scene were finally tested. A DNA profile was obtained from the sweatshirt by Cellmark, a private forensics lab, and when run through the criminal offender DNA database CODIS, it identified as Charles Boney, an 11-time convicted felon who was released from prison a few weeks before the murders. After further processing, it was also found that the fingerprints at the scene could not be excluded as belonging to Boney. Charles Boney had gained the nickname the Shoe Bandit due to spending almost a decade in prison for a series of crimes in Bloomington, Indiana, where he held multiple women at gunpoint and satisfied his foot fetish by stealing their shoes. Evidence from the crime scene of the Camm murder showed that Kim Camm had struggled against her attacker before her death, and if you'll recall, the killer also removed her socks and shoes. This pointed towards Boney being the possible attacker, and this was corroborated when Kim's DNA was found on the shirt sleeve of the sweatshirt, likely from Boney having his arm around her neck and coming into contact with her mouth. The writing on the inside of the sweatshirt, Backbone, was also known to be Boney's nickname in prison. Police also believe that the handprint on the vehicle came from Boney leaning with his left hand on the passenger side door of the Camm's Ford Bronco, while he reached in and shot both children with his right hand. Boney was interviewed by the Indiana State Police and initially denied knowing David Camm after police suggested he had met him playing basketball, saying he had never played basketball with Camm. He also told police he had given his clothing to the Salvation Army after his release from prison, but later admitted that this was a lie. Once police had confirmed the handprint on the car was likely Boney's, he was given the choice by prosecutors to testify against David Camm or be the only defendant and possibly face the death penalty. He changed his story, and despite previously giving contradictory statements, said that he had met David while playing basketball at a community park, and after David learned about his criminal past, asked Boney to get him a, quote, clean gun, end quote. Boney then agreed to sell him the gun that killed his family. He said he had arrived at the family home to give Camm the gun, wrapped in his sweatshirt, and gave it to him before witnessing Camm immediately turn and murder his family. Boney claimed that this was why his fingerprints and shirt were found at the crime scene, but his story does not account for Kim's DNA being found on his sweatshirt. The prosecution refiled David Camm's murder charges with an added charge of conspiracy, deciding to charge Camm and Boney as co-conspirators of the murder. David's second trial began on January 17, 2006, with Charles Boney's trial happening at the same time. Prosecutors once again alleged that David had sexually abused his daughter Jill on the day of the murders, and that Kim had discovered this, thus giving him motive to kill them. Crime scene experts and blood spatter experts all had differing opinions during the trial, with some stating that the blood spatter on David's shirt would only be there if he had been within 4 feet of Jill when she was shot, and others saying it could be from brushing against her after she was dead. Some of Kim Camm's friends also took the stand and testified against David, giving the theory that he was sexually abusing his daughter plausibility. Although the medical examiner who originally examined Jill's body only stated that she had sustained blunt force trauma to her genitals, the jury during this trial stated that they were convinced that David had molested his daughter due to expert testimony from a forensic pediatrician with the Kentucky Medical Examiner's Office, who, quote, all but confirmed that Jill had been molested by David, end quote. After the second trial, David was once again found guilty of all 3 murders and the additional conspiracy charge on March 3, 2006, and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In his own trial 3 months earlier in January, a jury also found Charles Boney guilty of the murders and conspiracy charges, and he was given a sentence of 225 years. David and his defense team continued fighting for his innocence, and the Indiana Supreme Court overturned his conviction once again, stating that the prosecution had biased the jury by saying that Camm had molested his daughter without sufficient evidence proving that he did it, and that the bias was furthered when they brought in the forensic pediatrician. A third trial was ordered, and this would be David Camm's final trial, beginning on August 9, 2013. The prosecutor who had served in the previous 2 trials, Keith Henderson, was removed from the third trial due to his plan to write and monetize a book on the case, creating a conflict of interest. The previous testimonies given by Kim's friends were also excluded from this trial, as they were ruled as hearsay. The prosecution for the third trial decided to base David's motive on the fact that Kim Camm purchased life insurance for the members of the family shortly before the murders, stating that he wanted the payouts. Boney also testified again, saying that after he witnessed David murder his family, David handed him back the gun and said, quote, you did this, end quote. He claimed that he panicked, tripping over Kim's shoes and placed them on the car, giving an explanation for the shoe placement and his handprint on the vehicle. He also claimed that he hadn't touched any members of the family, but this was proven to be a lie when the defense had DNA testing conducted on all the victims' clothing, with Boney's DNA being found on all of them. The defense threw further doubt on the prosecution's case when they told the jury how Rodney Englert, the bloodstain expert who had previously testified for the prosecution, had embellished his credentials. During the deliberation, the jury agreed that the timing of the life insurance being purchased was strange, but they decided it was not a sufficient motive for David to murder his family. On October 24th of 2013, 13 years after Kim, Bradley, and Jill were killed, David Camm was found not guilty on all charges. Charles Boney remains in jail for the murders, although he has stuck with his story and continues to insist that David was the one who killed his family. Kim's family, including her parents Frank and Janice Wren, also continue to state that they believe David was the killer. They attempted to file a wrongful death lawsuit against Camm, but dropped it in 2014. David Camm sued Floyd County and several state officers on the basis of wrongful prosecution, and later sued the state of Indiana for the same reasons. He settled with Floyd County for $450,000 in 2016, and in 2022 the state of Indiana awarded him $4.6 million in damages for malicious prosecution and wrongful imprisonment. When asked about his journey to clear his name, David stated, quote, "I care what people think about me. However it turns out, the journey will continue until I am no longer in this world." End quote. There are many things that we can learn from this case, both within the forensic community and the public at large. This case greatly illustrates the dangers of tunnel vision, or when police focus on or decide that someone is responsible for a crime, thus ignoring any other evidence and neglecting to explore every possibility of a case. This led to evidence not being tested when it should have, leaving compelling DNA evidence out of the first few trials, which partially led to David Camm's conviction. It is important that in the future police avoid this bias by exploring all possibilities of a case before deciding that someone is guilty, especially if there are multiple suspects. Something that will aid this is the collection and testing of all relevant evidence at crime scenes, since if the police had tested the sweatshirt found at the crime scene, the clothes of the victims, and the handprint on the car, they would have been led to Charles Boney as a suspect much sooner. On the expert testimony side of things, it is important that any forensic scientist or expert have the proper credentials before examining any evidence or serving as an expert witness. If Rodney Englert had not exaggerated his credentials, they may have picked another expert with the proper credentials to testify in court, and if he was properly qualified, he may have been able to correctly identify the blood spatter patterns during the first trial. As a result of this case and many others where similar incidents occurred, there is now a greater vetting process for both expert witnesses in the courtroom and forensic science practices to help avoid any wrongful convictions based on wrongful testimony or junk science. I encourage all the listeners out there to consider the information I have given you as you hear about other cases like David Camm's, especially with ethical misconduct involved, since their convictions may also be based on an unreasonable degree of scientific certainty. Thank you all very much for listening, and stay safe out there.